On this day in history, Grand Prince Stephen I of Hungary is named the first king of Hungary by Pope Sylvester II in 1001 AD. With this is included a quick excerpt of his life as detailed in the Encyclopedia Britannica 1944 edition. Stephen I, also known as Saint Stephen, 977 to 1038, King of Hungary, was the son of Geza, Duke of Hungary, and of Sarolta, one of the few Magyar Christian ladies. His tutors included the German priest Bruno, the Czech priest Radla, and an Italian knight, Theodate of San Servino, who taught him arms and letters. In 996, Stephen married Gisela, the daughter of Duke Henry II of Bavaria. In the following year, his father died, and the young prince was confronted by a formidable pagan reaction between the Drave and Lake Balaton. Stephen hastened against the rebels, bearing before him the banner of St. Martin of Tours, whom he now chose to be his patron saint, and routed the rebels at Vesperem in 998, assuming the royal title immediately afterwards. The rest of Stephen's life was spent largely in a struggle against the pagan nobles, which engrossed his energies, and compelled him to adopt a pacific policy towards the emperors of the East and West. But when attacked by the Emperor Conrad in 1030, Stephen repelled the invasion successfully. He died at Esztergom in 1038, and was canonized in 1083. On this day in history, Mercurius becomes Pope John II, the first pope to adopt a new name upon elevation to the papacy, on January 2nd, 533. Included in this is a quick excerpt of his life as described in the Encyclopedia Britannica 1944 edition. John II, Pope from 533 to 535. Also named Mercurius, succeeded Boniface II. At the instance of Justinian, he adopted the proposition Unius de Triniente passus est in carne as a test of the orthodoxy of certain Scythian monks accused of Nestorian tendencies. He was succeeded by Agapetus I. On this day in history, January 3rd, 1803, Douglas William Gerald, English journalist and playwright, was born. Included in this is an excerpt surmising the life of Douglas William Gerald, from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Douglas William Gerald, born 1803, died 1857, English dramatist and man of letters, was born in London on January 3, 1803. His father, Samuel Gerald, actor, was at that time lessee of the Little Theatre of Willesby, near Cranebrook in Kent, but in 1807 he removed to Sheerness. December 1813, the son joined the guardianship Namur, and served as midshipman until the peace of 1815. He saw nothing of the war save a number of wounded soldiers from Waterloo, but till his dying day there lingered traces of his early passion for the sea. The peace of 1815 ruined Samuel Gerald. There was no more prize money. On January 1st, 1816, he removed with his family to London, where the ex-midshipman began the world again as a printer's apprentice, and in 1819 became a compositor in the printing house of the Sunday Monitor. Gerald soon began to write for the press, and then for the stage. His first piece was a comedy, More Frightened Than Hurt, Sadler Wells, 1821. And he was presently engaged by Davidge at the Coburg Theatre to produce dramas and farces at a few pounds a week. In 1829, he made a resounding success with the three-act melodrama Black-Eyed Susan, Surrey Theatre. He now achieved a salary of £5 a week as a dramatic writer, and was independent enough to refuse to do adaptations. The Bride of Ludgate, December 8, 1831, was the first of a number of his plays produced at Drury Lane. The other patent houses threw their doors open to him also. The Adelphi had already done so, and in 1836 Gerald became co-manager of the Strand Theatre with W. J. Hammond, his brother-in-law. The venture was not successful, and the partnership was dissolved. While it lasted, Gerald wrote his only tragedy, The Painter of Ghent, and himself appeared in the title role. He continued to write sparkling comedies till 1854, the date of his last piece, The Heart of Gold. Meanwhile, he was a contributor to the monthly magazine Blackwood's, the New Monthly, and the Athenaeum. To the Punch, the publication which of all others is associated with his name, he contributed from its second number in 1841
till within a few days of his death. He founded and edited for some, though with indifferent success, the Illuminated Magazine, Gerald's Shilling Magazine, and Douglas Gerald's weekly newspaper. And under his editorship, Lloyd's weekly newspaper rose from almost non-entity to a circulation of 182,000. Douglas Gerald died at his house, Kilburn Priory, in London, on June 8, 1857. On this day in history, January 4th, 1909, explorer Aeneas Mackintosh of the Nimrod expedition escaped death by fleeing across ice floes. Included in this is an excerpt surmising the expedition by the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. After his return invalidated from the Discovery, Lieutenant Shackleton planned a fresh expedition and started in the small whaler Nimrod from Lyttelton, New Zealand, on January 1st, 1908, being towed by a steamer to the Antarctic Circle in order to save coal. The expedition established itself as Cape Royds on Ross Island, some 20 miles north of Scott's winter quarters of 1904, a hut being built in the ship returning to New Zealand for the winter. A new departure in Antarctic sledging was initiated by the use of Manchurian ponies. Before the winter set in, a party under Professor T.W.E. David reached the summit of the active volcano, Mount Erebus. In the succeeding summer, that same leader made a very notable sledge journey to the South Magnetic Pole, situated in latitude 72 degrees 25 minutes south, 155 degrees 16 minutes east, at an altitude of over 7,000 feet. The greatest achievement of this remarkable expedition was the journey made by Shackleton himself with 3 companions who reached the latitude of 88 degrees 23 minutes south, discovering a route on to the plateau by the way of the gigantic Breadmore Glacier, and pioneering the way to the pole itself. This must rank as the greatest sledge journey ever made without the help of supporting parties. The party narrowly escaped disaster from causes somewhat similar to those which destroyed the Scott party 4 years later, but it had reached the ship just in time, and the whole expedition returned without losing a man. On this day in history, January 5th, 1757, Louis XV of France survives an assassination attempt by Robert François Damier, who becomes the last person to be executed in France by drawing and quartering, the traditional form of capital punishment used for regicides. Included in this is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica summarizing Robert François Damier's life. Robert François Damier, born 1715, died 1757, a Frenchman who made an attempt on the life of Louis XV on January 5, 1757. As the king was entering his carriage, he rushed forward and stabbed him with a knife, inflicting only a slight wound. His mind seems to have been unhinged by the ecclesiastical controversies of the moment. He was condemned as a regicide and sentenced to be torn in pieces by horses in the Place de Grève. Before being put to death, he was barbarously tortured. On this day in history, January 6, 1066, following the death of Edward the Confessor on the previous day, the Witan meets to confirm Harold Godwinson as the new King of England. Harold is crowned the same day, sparking a succession crisis that will eventually lead to the Norman conquest of England. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 Encyclopedia Britannica edition regarding the life of Harold II. Harold II, born circa 1022, died 1066, King of the English, the second son of Earl Goodwine, was born about 1022. While still very young, before 1045, he was appointed through his father's influence with Edward the Confessor to the earldom of the East Angles. He shared his father's outlawry and banishment in 1051, but while Goodwine went to Flanders, Harold, with his brother Leofwine, took refuge in Ireland. In 1052, the uneasiness felt at the visit to England of William, Duke of Normandy, who was known to covet the English throne, caused a reaction in favor of Goodwine, who returned to England with his sons under arms. The Witan finally decreed that their lands should be restored. Harold therefore received his earldom of the East Angles, and on his father's death in 1053 succeeded him in the greater earldom of the West Saxons. Svein having died while on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, Harold was now the chief man in the kingdom, and the later part of Edward's reign was virtually the reign of Harold. On the death, 1055, of Siward, Earl of Northumbria, Edward, at the instigation of Harold, appointed his brother Tostig, Earl of Northumbria. Earl Halfgar looked upon this appointment as a menace to the Mercian house, and his opposition led Harold to procure his outlawry by the Witan. Aelfgar then joined Grofid, Prince of North Wales, in an attack on Hereford, as the result of which Aelfgar regained his position as Earl of East Anglia. In 1057, with the exception of Mercia, Harold and his brothers held all the earldoms throughout England. Aelfgar, in order to secure a useful ally, married his daughter Edelgif to Grofid. Aelfgar died in 1062, and was succeeded by his son Edwin. In spite of the alliance between the Mercians and the Welsh, Harold and Tostig raided Wales in 1063, and forced Grufid, who was eventually killed by his own men, to flee. In 1063, Harold was shipwrecked on the French coast and captured by the Normans, who only released him on his oath on sacred relics, though at the time he was unaware of their nature, to support William in any claim for the English throne. Probably on his return to England, though the date is uncertain, Harold married Edelgith, Edith, sister of Edwin, and widow of Grufid, thus conciliating the powerful Earl of Mercia. His mistress, Eadgith of the Swan Neck, the mother of his children, was still living. In 1065, the Northumbrians revolted against Tostig's rule, choosing Morkere, brother of Edwin of Mercia, in his place. Harold acted as mediator, but was compelled to agree to the banishment of Tostig, who was thenceforth his bitterest enemy. On January 6, 1066, Edward died, recommending Harold as his successor. He was accordingly elected at once and crowned. He won over the men of Northumbria and prepared against the attacks which threatened on both sides. William challenged the crown, alleging both a bequest of Edward in his favor and Harold's oath, and prepared to invade England. From May to September, Harold kept men and ships in readiness on the south coast, but at last provisions failed, and he returned to London. At this time Harald Hardrada of Norway, supported by Tostig in the north, invaded England. Together they sailed up the Humber, defeated Edwin and Morkere, and received the submission of York. Harold hurried northwards, and on September 25th won a complete victory over the Northmen at Stamford Bridge, in which Tostig and Harald Hardrada were slain. 2 days later, Harold received news that William had landed at Pevensey, and he marched southward as fast as possible. He gathered his army in London from all southern and eastern England, while Edwin and Morkere held the north. The king then marched into Sussex and engaged the Normans, October 14th, 1066, on the hill of Senlac near Battle. After a fight lasting all day, the Normans had the victory. Harold, wounded by an arrow in the eye, and his 2 brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, lay dead on the field. Harold had 3 sons, Godwine, Edmund, and Magnus, and 2 daughters, probably the children of Edith of the Swan Neck. Another son was named Ulf. By his wife, Eldgith, who was sent for safety to Chester in 1066, he had a posthumous son, Harold, who took part in the expedition of Magnus Barefoot to the Scottish Isles in 1098. Harold's body is said to have been taken from the cairn of stones on the seashore where it was originally buried to Waltham. On this day in history, January 7th, 1502, Pope Gregory XIII is born. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of Encyclopaedia Britannica summarizing his life. Gregory XIII, Ugo Buoncompagno, Pope from 1572 to 1585, was born on January 7th, 1502, in Bologna, where he taught until called to Rome, 1539, by Paul III, who employed him in various offices. He was prominent in the Council of Trent, 1562 to 63. In 1564 he was made cardinal by Pius IV, and in the following year sent to Spain as legate. On May 13, 1572, he was chosen pope to succeed Pius V. Having failed to rouse Spain and Venice against the Turks, Gregory attempted to form a general coalition against Protestants. He subsidized Philip II in his wars in the Netherlands. aided the Catholic League in France, incited attacks upon Elizabeth by way of Ireland. With the aid of the Jesuits, whose privileges he multiplied, he conducted a vigorous propaganda. Among his noteworthy achievements are the reform of the calendar on February 24, 1582, the improved edition of the Corpus Juris Canonici in 1582, the splendid Georgian chapel in St. Peter's, the fountains of the Piazza Navona, the Quirinal Palace, and many other public works. To meet the expenses entailed, Gregory restored to confiscation on the pretext of deficient titles or long-standing arrearages, but with disastrous results to the public peace. Gregory died on April 10, 1585. On this day in history, January 8, 1815, Andrew Jackson leads American forces in victory over the British during the Battle of New Orleans. Included in this is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica summarizing the battle. This was the final engagement of the American War of 1812, fought on January 8, 1815, between the forces of the United States under Major General Andrew Jackson and those of Great Britain under Major General Sir Edward Pakenham. The abdication of Napoleon in April 1814 made it possible for Great Britain to give more attention to her American antagonists. The Gulf of Mexico region was selected for the attack, and late in 1814, a fleet of 50 vessels and an army of nearly 10,000 veterans were dispatched to the region of the Mississippi River. The British advance was made by way of Lake Borgne and the Villeray Canal to the bank of the Mississippi, where the advance guard appeared on December 23, 1814. Jackson was wholly surprised by this movement, but with superior force made an immediate December 24th attack with such effect that the British decided to wait for the main army and their artillery. This gave Jackson time to fortify a dry canal and to receive additional reinforcements. At last, in the early morning of January 8, 1815, a direct attack was made on the now strongly entrenched line of the defenders at Chalmette near the Mississippi River. It failed disastrously, with a loss of about 2,000 out of 9,000 British troops engaged, among the dead being Pakenham and Major General Gibbs. The British attack on the right bank had been successful, but General Lambert, Pakenham's successor, was unwilling to take the responsibility of any further fighting. The expedition was soon abandoned, and by the end of the month the troops embarked for England. The American loss proved to be 71, out of a total of about 4,000 engaged on both sides of the river. The Battle of New Orleans had no bearing on the outcome of the war, as peace had been made at Ghent 15 days before the battle was fought, but news of the battle and the peace reached Washington almost together. On this day in history, January 9, 1822, the Portuguese Prince Pedro I of Brazil decides to stay in Brazil against the orders of the Portuguese King João VI, beginning the Brazilian independence process. The following is an excerpt from the Encyclopedia Britannica 1944 edition regarding the steps towards Brazil's independence. Although Dom João enjoyed a certain degree of personal popularity, his government, corrupt and extravagant, aroused much opposition, which was still further increased by the fermentation of liberal ideas produced by the French Revolution. In Pernambuco, a revolt broke out in 1817, and was put down with difficulty after a republic had been formed which lasted for 90 days. Still more critical was the situation in Lisbon. After the departure of the French, Portugal had been governed by an arbitrary and tyrannical regency. The growing discontent found vent in the Revolution of 1820. The regency was swept aside by the Cortes, which had not met for over a century, was summoned for the purpose of drawing up a constitution. The presence of Dom João in Portugal was imperative if the revolutionary movement was to be kept in hand. On April 22, 1821, he appointed his son, Dom Pedro, regent, and 2 days later set sail for Lisbon. The tasks confronting the young prince were truly formidable. Antagonisms between the Portuguese and Brazilians were becoming increasingly bitter, Republican propaganda was active, and, worst of all, Dom Pedro had to face responsibility of a separation of Brazil from Portugal as a result of the short-sighted policy of the Cortes at Lisbon. The majority of this assembly were in favor of restoring Brazil to her former status of colonial dependence. Without waiting for the Brazilian deputies, they proceeded to undo most of the reforms introduced into Brazil by Dom João. Fearful lest Dom Pedro might head a movement for independence, the prince was ordered to return to Europe in order to complete his political education. These acts aroused great indignation in Brazil. Supported by the majority of Brazilians, Dom Pedro openly defied the Cortes by his refusal to return to Lisbon. In January 1822, he formed a ministry in which the chief portfolios were held by two distinguished Paulistas, José Bonifacio de Andrada y Silva and his brother, Carlos Antonio. The former, known as the Patriarch of Independence, was a scholar of European reputation and proved at this critical juncture a tower of strength to the young regent. Events followed rapidly. On June 3rd, Dom Pedro convoked a legislative and constituent assembly. On September 7th, on the plain of the Ipiranga, near the city of Sao Paulo, he solemnly proclaimed the independence of Brazil, and on December 1st, 1822, was crowned emperor. With the cooperation of Lord Cochrane, an able British naval officer who had entered Brazilian service, the strong Portuguese garrisons were forced to return to Europe. Before the end of 1823, independence had become an accomplished fact, although Portuguese recognition was not secured until 1825. On this day in history, January 10th, 49 BCE, Julius Caesar crosses the Rubicon, signaling the start of civil war. Included in this is a summary of the Rubicon River as detailed in the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Rubicon, a small stream of ancient Italy which flowed into the Adriatic between Arminium and Cesena, and formed the boundary between Italy and the province of Cisalpine Gaul in the Republican times, while Augustus adopted the Marcaea a few miles farther south. Hence, Caesar's crossing of it in 49 BC meant a declaration of war against Pompey and the Senate. The historic importance of this event gave rise to the phrase crossing the Rubicon, for a step which definitely commits a person to a given course of action. Its upper course is represented by that of Paisatella, called Rubagon in the 11th or 12th century, and now Rugon or Urgon, and its lower portion by the Fiumicino, which the Orgon once joined. The point was marked by a station on the Via Aemilia, below their confluence, 12 miles northwest of Arminium, bearing the name Ad Confluentes, and here is still preserved a three-arched bridge. On this day in history, January 11th, 1787, William Herschel discovers Titania and Oberon, two moons of Uranus. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the discovery of the two satellites. In January 1787, Herschel detected two satellites of Uranus on which the inner one, now known as Titania, had a period of 9 days, the outer, Oberon, of 13.5 days. He also on other occasions saw what he supposed to be two additional satellites, but these objects could not have been on this character. In 1851-52, William Lassell of Malta, in conjunction with his assistant A. Marth, observed two satellites yet nearer the planet than those of Herschel. These are now known as Ariel and Umbriel. Their periodic times are about 2.5 and 4 days respectively. Lassell's telescopes, which were reflectors, were superior in light power to others of his time, and these inner satellites were not seen by other astronomers for more than 20 years after their discovery. Indeed, doubts of their reality were only resolved in 1873, when they were observed with the Washington 26-inch telescope. The most remarkable feature about these satellites is the very high inclination of their orbit planes. This amounts to 98 degrees to the plane of the planet's orbit, and 97.8 degrees to the ecliptic, so that the motion of the satellites is really retrograde. The result of the high inclination is that, as Uranus revolves in its orbit, there are two opposite points at which the planes are presented edgewise to view, and the satellites will be seen to travel nearly north and south in the telescopic field. At intermediate points their orbits will appear circular. Their former appearance last occurred in 1924, and the later will next be seen in 1945. On this day in history, January 12, 475, Byzantine Emperor Zeno is forced to flee his capital at Constantinople, and his general, Basiliscus, gains control of the empire. The following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the life of Basiliscus. Basiliscus died 477, Emperor of the East from 475 to 477. His sister, Verena, was married to the Byzantine Emperor Leo I and was able to prevail on Leo in 468 to appoint her brother Eastern commander of the expedition against the Vandal leader Genseric. The expedition, a joint effort of the eastern and western sections of the Roman Empire, was intended to rid Italy and the Mediterranean region of the threat of Vandal conquest. More than 1,000 ships sailed from Constantinople for Carthage, where Genseric was entrenched. But when Basiliscus arrived, he ill-advisedly agreed to a 5-day truce with the Vandal leaders. During that time, Genseric attacked and was able to destroy a large part of the eastern fleet. Basiliscus, badly defeated, was forced to retreat, and on his return to Constantinople, he was banished for his incompetence. He returned during the reign of Zeno, Leo's successor, and was able to lead a successful revolt against Zeno and to usurp the throne. He proved no more competent as an emperor than he had been as a general, however. And Zeno, taking advantage of popular discontent, was soon able to overthrow Basiliscus and resume his position as Byzantine emperor. Basiliscus was banished to Phrygia, where he died shortly thereafter.
On this day in history, January 13th, 1793, Nicolas Jean Hugon de Basville, representative of revolutionary France, is lynched by a mob in Rome. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the life of Nicolas Jean Hugon de Basville. Basville, or Nicolas Jean Hugon de Basville, born 1753 to died 1793, French journalist and diplomatist. Was born at Abbeville, February 7, 1753. At the outbreak of the Revolution, he became editor of the Mercure International. Then, through the Girondist minister, Lebrun Tondu, he entered the diplomatic service, went, in May 1792, as Secretary of Legation to Naples, and was shortly afterwards sent, without official status, to Rome. His conduct in Rome, reflecting as it did his extreme revolutionary views, enraged the Roman populace. A riot broke out on January 13, 1793, and Basville, who was driving with his family to the Corso, was dragged from his carriage and so roughly handled that he died. The responsibility for the murder was laid by the Convention of the Pope. In 1797, by an article of the Treaty of Tolentino, the papal government agreed to pay 300 million francs to the French government as compensation. The poet Vincenzo Monti, in his epic Basvilliani, described the soul of Basville looking down on the revolutionary scene as a penance before entering paradise. On this day in history, January 14th, 1797, the Battle of Rivoli is fought with a decisive French victory by Napoleon Bonaparte, marking the beginning of the end of the War of the First Coalition and the start of French hegemony over Italy for 2 decades. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the battle. The Battle of Rivoli. This battle, fought on January 14th, 1797, was the climax of the repeated Austrian efforts to relieve the vital fortress of Mantua, which blocked Napoleon's advance towards Vienna. Napoleon's victory cleared the way for his advance into Austria. On this day in history, January 15th, 69 AD, Otho seizes power in Rome, proclaiming himself Emperor of Rome, beginning a reign of only 3 months. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the life of Otho. Otho, Marcus Salvius, born 32 AD, died 69 AD, Roman Emperor, was born on April 28, 32 AD. He appears first as one of the wildest of Nero's court. In 58, he refused to divorce his wife Poppaea Sabina at Nero's bidding, and was thereupon sent to be governor of Lusitania, where he remained 10 years. In 68, Galba, governor of the neighboring province of Tarraconensis, rebelled against Nero, and Otho accompanied him to Rome, hoping to succeed him. In January 69, Galba adopted Piso as his successor, and Otho at once organized a revolt of the Praetorian Guard, and on January 15th had himself proclaimed emperor, murdered Galba and Piso, and was accepted by the Senate. He owed his success partly to Galba's disciplinary measures being unpopular with the guards, partly to the power of the memory of Nero, which he further enlisted by restoring his statues and the officials of his household, and proposing to complete his palace, the Golden House.
News soon arrived, however, that the army in Germany had declared for Vitellius. On March 14th he started northwards to prevent the Vitellians entering Italy. In this he failed, but his advance guard successfully defended Placentia against Alenius Cesena, compelling him to retire to Cremona, and he held the line of the Po. Opinions were divided in Otho's camp, he himself wishing to force a decisive battle, others advising him to wait for the arrival of the troops from Dalmatia. Otho prevailed, and the main army crossed the Po to Bedriacum, Otho staying behind with the reserve at Brixellum, on the southern bank. The Othonian forces were defeated outside Cremona, and deserted to the enemy. Otho refused to renew the struggle and committed suicide in his tent on the morning of April 15th, 69, and was buried in Brixellum. On this day in history, January 16th, 1458 BC, Hatshepsut dies at the age of 50 and is buried in the Valley of the Kings. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the life of Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut, or Hatasu, born around 1500 BC, Egyptian queen, daughter of Thutmose I, sister and queen of the short-reigned Thutmose II, and after whose death she secured the crown in spite of the opposition from the future Thutmose III, who was the son either of Thutmose I or of Thutmose II. She acquired fame by her magnificent terrace temple at Deir al-Bahri, and by her obelisks at Thebes, the expenses of which were partly met by the treasure-hunting expeditions which she sent to South Arabia. The long military inactivity of her reign, during which state affairs were in the hands of her partisans, shook Egyptian power in Asia. In 1841 her tomb was discovered on a cliff behind the Valley of the King's Tomb. Her successor, Thutmose III, had her name and figure cut off from the sculptures in her temple and treated the remains of her partisans in a similar manner.
On this day in history, January 17th, 1524, Giovanni de Verranza set sail westward from Madeira to find a sea route to the Pacific Ocean. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the life of Giovanni de Verranza. Giovanni de Verranza, born circa 1480, died circa 1527, Florentine navigator. Was born near Florence, but while he was still in his 20s, became associated with the French fleet. It is almost certain that in the early 16th century he made some raids on the Indies, and it is known that in 1522 he was responsible for capturing the 2 ships which Cortés had dispatched, loaded with spoils from Mexico to Spain. The captured wealth convinced Francis I of France that America was well worth his attention, and the following year he put Verranza in charge of an American expedition, ostensibly to find a northwest passage to the Orient, but actually to extend France's empire to America. In 1524 the Florentine set sail, arriving in North America in February of that year. He landed probably off the coast of North Carolina, although there is some dispute about the actual spot, and it may have been considerably farther either to the north or to the south. Thence he traveled northward to Newfoundland, discovering en route the Hudson River and Manhattan Island, and visiting Narragansett Bay, which he may also have discovered. He returned to France in the same year, reaching Dieppe on July 8th, and the account of his discoveries, which he wrote for the king on his arrival, is the first description we have of the northeast coast of North America. Nothing is certain of the eventual fate of Verranza, although it is thought that he was either killed by Indians or hanged as a pirate on a later expedition to America, probably South America. On this day in history, January 18th, 1670, Henry Morgan captures Panama. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the life of Henry Morgan. Sir Henry Morgan, born circa 1635, died 1688, Welsh buccaneer and lieutenant governor of Jamaica, is said to have been kidnapped as a boy at Bristol and sold as a slave at Barbados, thence making his way to Jamaica, and is possibly to be identified with the Captain Morgan who accompanied the expedition of John Morris and Jackman when Vildamos, Trujillo, and Granada were taken. In 1666 he commanded a ship in Edward Mansfield's expedition which seized the island of Providence or Santa Catalina, and shortly afterwards was chosen by the buccaneers as their admiral. In 1668 he was commissioned by Sir Thomas Modyford, the governor of Jamaica, to capture some Spanish prisoners.
in order to discover details of the threatened attacks on Jamaica. He took Porto Principe, Portobello, on the mainland, and collected a large sum from the governor of Panama. Entrusted with another expedition by Mudiford against the Spaniards, he ravaged the coast of Cuba, and in 1669 sacked Maracaibo, and afterwards Gibraltar. Returning to Maracaibo, he found 3 Spanish ships waiting to intercept him, but these he destroyed or captured, recovered a considerable amount of treasure from one which he had sunk, and exacted a heavy ransom for evacuating the place. On his return to Jamaica, a new commission was given to Morgan, as commander-in-chief of all ships of war in Jamaica, to levy war on the Spaniards. He recaptured the island of Santa Catalina in December 1670, and in 1671 took Panama. Meanwhile, on July 8, 1670, a treaty had been signed between Spain and England, and both Mudiford and Morgan were ordered home under arrest to answer for their conduct. Morgan, however, soon gained the king's favor, and in 1674 was appointed lieutenant governor of Jamaica, and was knighted, leaving England in December. He was charged by Lord Vaughan, afterwards Earl of Carbery, the governor, soon after his appointment, of encouraging privateering. He intrigued against his colleagues and successive governors of Jamaica, and participated in various drunken orgies. Finally, on October 12, 1683, he was suspended in Jamaica from all employments. He died in August 1688.
On this day in history, January 19th, 379, Emperor Gratian elevates Flavius Theodosius ad Sirmium to Augustus, and gives him authority over all the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the life of Theodosius. Theodosius I, the Great, son of Theodosius, Valentinian's great general, who in 368-69 saved Britain from the Picts, who suppressed the revolt of Firmus in Mauretania, 372. Shortly after, 376, the elder Theodosius was put to death, perhaps by orders of Valens. The younger Theodosius was born about the year 346. He was a native of Spain, but the exact place of his birth is uncertain. He accompanied his father into Britain, 368, and a little later defeated the Sarmatians, who had invaded Moesia, 374. On his father's death he retired to his native place, where he lived quietly till after the great battle of Adrianople, August 9th, 378, when Gratian summoned him to share the empire. After gaining some fresh victories over the Sarmatians, Theodosius was made Augustus at Sirmium on January 19th, 379, and was assigned all the eastern provinces, including part of Illyricum. In 379, Theodosius, after reorganizing the army at Thessalonica, carried on a successful campaign of skirmishes along the Danube, and induced numerous Gothic bands to give in their allegiance. His lieutenant Moderes, a Gothic refugee, defeated the invaders severely in Thrace. In 381, he was called upon to meet 2 armies of invaders. He conducted in person the war against the Visigoths under Fritigern, this campaign being only ended by Fritigern's death. The defense of the Danube against the Ostrogoths under Alatheus and Saphrax was entrusted to the general Promotus, who severely defeated the enemy in an attempt to cross the river. Theodosius attained even greater successes by his diplomacy. He persuaded the fugitive Visigoth king Anartharic to enter his service, and enlisted 40,000 of his former enemies as feudatari, providing them with settlements in various parts of the realm. In 383, Theodosius created his eldest son, Arcadius Augustus. The same year saw the revolt of Maximus in Britain and the murder of Gratian. For 5 years, Theodosius consented to accept the usurper as his colleague, but when Maximus attempted a few years later to make himself master of Italy, Theodosius advanced against the invader and overthrew him near Aquileia, July 28, 388. This victory was followed by the murder of Maximus and his son Victor, after whose death Theodosius conferred upon Valentinian II all that part of the empire which his father had held. After celebrating a triumph in Rome, 389, he stayed to arrange the government of Italy for another 2 years, if we may trust the evidence of Zosimus. From the end of the year 388, Theodosius resigned himself to gluttony and voluptuous living, from which he was only roused by the news that in the Western Empire
Arbogast had slain the younger Emperor Valentinian and set up the grammarian Eugenius in his stead, May 15th, 392. Theodosius at once marched out against Eugenius. The armies met near the river Frigidius, some 36 miles distant from Aquileia. On the first day, Theodosius's barbarians, engaging with those of the hostile army, were almost destroyed, and the victory seemed to be with Eugenius. After a night of prayer, towards cockcrow, the emperor was cheered by a vision of St. Philip and St. John, who, mounted on white steeds, promised him success. On the second day, the issue was doubtful till, if we may trust the congruent testimony of all the contemporary church historians, a sudden gust of wind blew back the enemy's arrows on themselves. This was the turning point of the battle. Eugenius was slain by the soldiers, and 2 days later Arbogast committed suicide, September 5th to 9th, 394. From the northeastern parts of Italy, Theodosius passed to Rome, where he had his son Honorius proclaimed emperor under the guardianship of Stilicho. Thence he retired to Milan, where he died of dropsy, January 17th, 395, leading the empire to be divided between his 2 sons, Honorius and Arcadius. On this day in history, January 20th, 250 AD, Pope Fabian is martyred during the Decian persecution. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the life of Fabian. Fabian, or Fabianus, saint, died 250. Pope and martyr, was chosen pope in January 236. He was martyred during the persecution under Decius on January 20th, 250, and was buried in the catacomb of Calixtus. He is said to have baptized the Emperor Philip and his son, to have improved the organization of the Church in Rome, to have appointed officials to register the deeds of the martyrs, and to have founded several churches in France. On this day in history, January 21st, 1774, Abdul Hamid I becomes Sultan of the Ottoman Empire and Caliph of Islam. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the life of Abdul Hamid I. Abdul Hamid I, born 1725, died 1789, Sultan of Turkey, son of Ahmed III, succeeded his brother Mustafa III in 1773 and died on April 7, 1789. On this day in history, January 22nd, 613, 8-month-old Constantine is crowned as co-emperor, Caesar, by his father Heraclius at Constantinople. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica summarizing the life of Constantine. Constantine III, son of the Emperor Heraclius, died 641. By his first wife, succeeded as joint emperor with Heracleonis, the son of Heraclius, by his second wife. Court intrigues nearly led to a civil war, which was prevented by the death of Constantine, May 641. He was supposed to have been poisoned by order of his stepmother. On this day in history, January 23, 393, Roman Emperor Theodosius I proclaims his 8-year-old son Honorius co-emperor. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the life of Honorius. Honorius Flavius, born 384, died 423, son of Theodosius I, ascended the throne as Emperor of the West in 395. During the early part of his reign, the West was attacked on all sides by barbarian hordes. Italy was saved by the exhortations of Honorius's guardian and father-in-law, the Vandal Stilicho. But Gaul was overrun by barbarians, winter of 406 to 407, and in 409 the central government was forced to abandon Britain. After the murder of Stilicho, 408, Italy was again invaded by Alaric, the Visigoths, and in 410 Rome was taken and sacked. Alaric died in the same year, and in 412 Honorius concluded peace with his brother-in-law and successor, Adolphus, who married the emperor's sister Placidia, and removed with his troops to southern Gaul. A succession of usurpers arose, 411 to 416, in Gaul and Spain, but were overthrown by Honorius's general, Constantius, who was rewarded with a share in the government, died 421. It was only as a supporter of the Orthodox Church and persecutor of the heathen that Honorius displayed any energy. In 399, the exercise of the pagan cult was prohibited, and the revenues of the temples, which were to be appropriated for the use of the public or pulled down, were confiscated to defray the expenses of the army. Honorius was equally severe on heretics, such as the Donatists and the Manichaeans. He is also to be credited with the abolition of the gladiatorial shows in 404, although there is said to be evidence of their existence later. A reduction of the taxes, improvements in criminal law, and the reorganization of the defensores civitatem, municipal officers whose duty it was to defend the rights of the people and set forth their grievances. Honorius at first established his court at Milan, but on the report of the invasion of Italy, fled to Ravenna, where he resided till his death on August 27th, 423. On this day in history, January 24th, 41 AD, Claudius is proclaimed Roman Emperor by the Praetorian Guard after they assassinate the previous emperor, his nephew Caligula. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica summarizing the life of Claudius. Claudius, also known as Tiberius Claudius Drusus Nero Germanicus, Roman Emperor, AD 41-54, son of Drusus and Antonia, nephew of the Emperor Tiberius and grandson of Livia, the wife of Augustus, was born at Lugdunum, Lyon, on August 1st, 10 BC. He was kept in the background by Augustus Tiberius, owing to his physical infirmities and apparent weakness of intellect, and lived in retirement. It was probably at this time that he became dependent on the company of freedmen. Under Caligula, he became more prominent, holding the consulship, AD 37, and other public posts. Though he was the emperor's butt, many people at Rome must have realized that he might succeed. On the murder of Caligula, Claudius, though not of the Julian genes, was made emperor by the Praetorians, who were rewarded with a large donative, and were probably increased in number. Claudius, though abnormal, was by no means the idiot that our hostile sources would suggest. Despite his pedantry, he had a certain shrewdness, and wished to govern well. In the earlier part of his reign, he extended the boundaries of the empire. Mauritania was subdued and annexed in 43, and in the same year Claudius himself took part in the famous expedition to Britain, which gave the Romans a footing in the south of the island. In 44, Judea, which had been entrusted to King Agrippa, was made once more a province, and in 46 the same fate overtook the client kingdom of Thrace. In his dealings with the provincials, Claudius, despite senatorial opposition, reverted to Julius Caesar's liberal policy. We possess part of his speech proposing that the chieftains of the Aedui should be admitted to the Senate, and his edict conferring citizenship on the Anauni. A large number of municipia and colonies in the provinces owe their origin to Claudius. The reign of Claudius is marked by the development of the emperor's personal service. There was an extension of procuratorial government in the provinces, including Thrace, Mauritania, and Judea, and provincial procurators were granted jurisdiction equal to that of the emperor in all cases related to the fiscus. A definite scale of salaries was also instituted, but even more notable was the increased power of the emperor's freedmen, who, while they remained his personal servants, became, in practice, powerful ministers, and received great rewards and honors. The rule of the freedmen, who, though efficient, were arrogant and corrupt, was resented by the nobility, but the practice was continued under later emperors, though not to the same extent. Another grievance was the increased importance of the emperor's private court. Under Augustus and Tiberius, its use had been restricted to certain cases of majestas, but Claudius had a passion for acting as judge. Vast numbers of cases were heard in camera, and the emperor's methods seem often to have been capricious. His public works include a new harbor at Ostia, the draining of the Fucine Lake, and the construction of two aqueducts, Aqua Claudia and Anio Novus. His revival of the censorship and extension of the pomerium may be quoted rather as examples of his antiquarianism than as practically important. In 47 he celebrated the Ludi Secularis. In the latter part of his reign his government degenerated, and he fell entirely under the influence of his favorites and his womankind. He had married, as his third wife, Messalina, who, in 47, if we are to believe Tacitus, actually went through a form of marriage with Silius unknown to Claudius. Narcissus brought about her execution, and at the prompting of Pallas, the a nationibus, Claudius married his niece Agrippina, a marriage which shocked Roman sentiment. She induced him to set aside his own son Britannicus and to adopt as heir Nero, her son by a former marriage. Claudius died suddenly in 54, poisoned, according to Tacitus, by Agrippina. He was deified, but Seneca's satire, the Apocolocyntosis, expressed the relief felt at his death. Claudius wrote several historical works, Magis inepti quam ineleganter, including his own autobiography, but all, unfortunately, are lost. On this day in history, January 25th, 1533, Henry VIII of England secretly marries his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the life of Anne Boleyn. Boleyn, or Bullen, Anne, born circa 1507, died 1536, Queen of Henry VIII of England, daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn, afterwards Earl of Wiltshire and Ormond, and of Elizabeth, daughter of Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, afterwards Duke of Norfolk, was born, according to Camden, in 1507, but an earlier date, 1502 or 1501, is given by some later writers. She visited France with her father about 1519, and was attached to the service of Queen Claude for a short time. She returned in 1521 or 1522 to England. Among her admirers was the poet Sir Thomas Wyatt, and among her definite suitors was Henry Percy, heir of the Earl of Northumberland. A series of grants and favors bestowed by Henry on her father between 1522 and 1525 have been regarded, with little justification, as a symptom of the king's affections. Anne, however, had no intention of being the king's mistress. She meant to be his queen. There is no absolute proof that Henry's passion was anterior to the proceedings taken for the divorce in May 1527, the celebrated love letters being undated. After the king's final separation from his wife in July 1531, Anne accompanied Henry on the visit to Francis I. In 1532, while Catherine was left at home, neglected and practically a prisoner, Henry married her about January 25, 1533. The exact date is unknown, their union not being made public till the following Easter. Subsequently, on May 28th, their marriage was declared valid, and that with Catherine null. And in June Anne was crowned at Westminster Hall. A weak, giddy woman of no stability of character, her success turned her head and caused her to behave with insolence and impropriety, in strong contrast with Catherine's quiet dignity under her misfortunes. She, and not the king, probably was the author of the petty persecutions inflicted upon Catherine and upon the Princess Mary, and her jealousy of the latter showed itself in spiteful malice. She incurred the remonstrances of the Privy Council and alienated her own friends and relations. But there were soon signs that Henry's affection, which had before been a genuine passion, had cooled or ceased. He resented her arrogance, and a few months after the marriage he gave her cause for jealousy, and disputes arose. Fate had prepared for Anne the same domestic griefs that had ruined Catherine. In September 1533, the birth of a daughter, afterwards Queen Elizabeth, instead of the long-hoped-for son, was a heavy disappointment. Next year there was a miscarriage, and on January 29, 1536, the day of Catherine's funeral, she gave birth to a dead male child. On May 1st, it became known that several of Anne's reputed lovers had been arrested. On the 2nd, Anne herself was committed to the Tower on a charge of adultery with various persons, including her own brother, Lord Rochford. On the 12th, Sir Francis Weston, Henry Norris, William Brereton, and Mark Smeaton were declared guilty of high treason, while Anne herself and Lord Rochford were condemned unanimously by an assembly of 26 peers on the 15th. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presided as Lord Steward, and gave sentence, weeping, that his niece was to be burned or beheaded as pleased the king. Her former lover, the Earl of Northumberland, left the court, seized with sudden illness. Her father had declared his conviction of his daughter's guilt at the trial of her reputed lovers. On the 16th, Anne informed Cranmer of a certain supposed impediment to her marriage with the king, according to some accounts a previous marriage with Northumberland, though the latter solemnly and positively denied it, which was never disclosed, but was pronounced, on the 17th, sufficient to invalidate her marriage. The same day all her reputed lovers were executed, and on the 19th she herself suffered death on Tower Green, her head being struck off with a sword by the executioner of Calais brought to England for the purpose. She had regarded the prospect of death with courage and almost with levity, laughing heartily as she put her hands about her little neck and recalled the skill of the executioner, wrote Sir William Kingston, Governor of the Tower. And also women executed, and all they have been in great sorrow, and to my knowledge this lady has much joy and pleasure in death. On the following day, Henry was betrothed to Jane Seymour. Anne Boleyn's guilt remains unproved. To Sir William Kingston, she protested her entire innocence, and on the scaffold, while expressing her submission, she made no confession. A principal witness for the charge of incest with Rochford's own wife, a woman of infamous character, afterwards executed for complicity in the intrigues of Catherine Howard. The discovery of Anne's misdeeds coincided in an extraordinary manner with Henry's disappointment in not obtaining by her a male heir, while the king's despotic power and the universal unpopularity of Anne both tended to hinder the administration of pure justice. But it is almost incredible that 2 grand juries, a petty jury, and a tribunal consisting of nearly all the lay peers of England, with the evidence before them, which we do not now possess, should have all unanimously passed a sentence of guilt contrary to the facts and their convictions, and that such a sentence should have been supported by Anne's own father and uncle. Anne is described as not one of the handsomest women in the world. She is of a middling stature, swarthy complexion, long neck, wide mouth, bosom not much raised, and in fact has nothing but the English king's great appetite, and her eyes, which are black and beautiful, and take great effect. On this day in history, January 26, 1837, Michigan is admitted as the 26th state to the United States. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the development of the Michigan Territory. Up to this time, the territory had still remained for the most part a wilderness in which the fur trade reaped the largest profits, its few small settlements being confined to the borders, and the inaccurate reports of the surveyors sent out by the United States government described the interior as a vast swamp with only here and there a little land fit for cultivation. The large number of hostile Indians was also a factor in making the territory unattractive, but during the efficient administration of Lewis Cass, governor of the territory from 1813 to 1831, the interference of the British was checked and many of the Indians were removed to the west of the Mississippi. Printing presses established during the same period at Detroit, Ann Arbor, Monroe, and Pontiac became largely instrumental in making the country better known. The first steamboat, the Walk in the Water, appeared at Detroit in 1818. The Erie Canal was opened in 1825. By 1830, a daily boat line was running between Detroit and Buffalo, and the population of Michigan, which was only 4,762 in 1810 and 8,896 in 1820, increased to 31,639 in 1830 and 212,267 in 1840. In 1819, the territory had been empowered to send a delegate to Congress. By 1832, the question of admission into the Union had arisen, and in 1835 a convention was called in Detroit. A constitution was framed in May, which was adopted by popular vote in October. State officers were elected, and application for admission was made. But a dispute with Ohio over the boundary between the two caused a delay in the admission of Michigan into the Union as a state until January 26, 1837. Although it was dominated almost continuously during the first 2 decades by the Democrats, Michigan in 1855 was the first state to give the Republicans a triumph at the polls. The Republicans continued to hold the state until 1932, with but 3 interruptions at times of national agrarian revolt. The rise of the automobile industry during the 20th century transformed the erstwhile farmer state into one dominated by the prosperous industry, a fact which made Michigan a focal point for suffering in the years following 1929. The closing of leading Detroit banks precipitated the national banking crisis of 1933. Unemployment and discontent helped in 1932 to give the state to the Democrats. Yet the political effect of improving business in 1934 was to restore the Republicans to control. During the campaign of 1936, Michigan commonly was regarded as doubtful, but it gave Roosevelt a strong majority and chose a Democratic governor. A Republican governor was elected in 1938. In 1940, Wilkie won the state by a slight majority, although a Democrat governor was elected.
On this day in history, January 27th, 98 AD, Trajan succeeds his adoptive father, Nerva, as Roman emperor. Under his rule, the Roman Empire will reach its maximum extent. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the life of Trajan. Trajan, Marcus Ulpius Trajanus, born 53 AD, died 117. Roman Emperor, was born at Ithaca in Spain on September 18, 53 AD. The family to which he belonged was probably Italian by blood. His father began as a common legionary soldier and fought his way up to the consulship and the governorship of Asia. The younger Trajan was a soldier born and bred. For 10 years he was a military tribune, serving all over the empire. Then he held important posts in Syria and Spain. By 89 he had a considerable military reputation. In that year he was ordered from further Spain to the Rhine to deal with the revolt of Saturninus. He covered the distance very quickly, but the rebellion had been crushed before his arrival. He was consul in 91. Nerva, on his ascension, made him consular legate of Upper Germany, and on the advice of L. Licinius Sura, adopted him as his son and successor on October 27, 97. The Senate confirmed the choice and acknowledged him as successor. Trajan at that time was in Germany. Shortly afterwards, at Cologne, he received news of the emperor's death, January 25, 98. Trajan's authority was at once acknowledged all over the empire. He gave the Senate an assurance like that given by Nerva, that he would neither kill nor degrade any senator, and ordered the foundation of a temple and cult in honor of his adoptive father. But he did not come to Rome till he had inspected the Rhine-Danube frontier. The Praetorians, who had been a menace to Nerva, were quickly overawed, and he proceeded to make his long-awaited entry into Rome. Here he at once made himself popular with both Senate and the people. Soon afterwards he left for his first Dacian campaign. It would appear that Trajan himself wrote an account of this war, but only one sentence has survived. We are left with the evidence of Trajan's column and the monuments at Adamclisi. This much may be said. Roman prestige and security were threatened by the terms of peace exacted by Decebalus from Domitian. Trajan took the initiative in 101. His advance, more or less unopposed at first, ended in an indecisive battle at Tepe, at the entrance to the Iron Gate Pass. Trajan retired to winter on the Danube. The winter seems to have been disturbed by a raid by the Dacians and Roxolani into Moesia. The next spring, Trajan invaded Dacia again. His advance ended in an attack on a stronghold, identified as Monsocetate, and a complete victory near Costes. Decebalus surrendered. A garrison was left at Sarmiz-Getsua, and Trajan withdrew. In 105, Decebalus revolted, and again, probably, invaded Moesia. Trajan started at once from Ancona, and seems to have spent the first season in Moesia, making his way to his bridge at Pontes, and wintering there. The next year, 106, after prolonged and desperate fighting, Sarmiz-Getsua was taken, and Decebalus committed suicide. Dacia was annexed, the capital became a colony, Ulpia Traiana, and the new province was gradually Romanized in the usual way. There followed 7 years of peace, broken at last by war with Parthia. The casus belli was the appointment by the new king of Parthia, Khosrow, of a nephew to the throne of Armenia, without the customary application to Rome, but there must have been something behind that, for Khosrow's instant apology failed to placate Trajan. There were 3 campaigns. The first, 114, resulted in the annexation of Armenia, almost without opposition. The next year, still without much fighting. Trajan occupied Mesopotamia up to the Tigris. There he halted and went to Antioch for the winter. In 116 he first marched through Edessa and Nisibis, forced the passage of the Tigris without difficulty, and annexed Adia Bene, which became the province of Assyria. Then he turned down the Tigris to Ctesiphon. Khosrow fled, and Trajan went on downstream to the shores of the Persian Gulf, where he looked over the waters to India and said sadly, "If only I were younger." The captured territory became the province of Parthia. Then, on his way back, the trouble started. Before the end of the year, a serious rising in the north had to be crushed, and the Parthians were threatening a counterattack. Trajan decided to abandon Lower Mesopotamia, installed the young prince Parthmasites as the king in Ctesiphon, and withdrew, not without trouble on the way.
Meanwhile, the Jews all over the east had risen and massacred everyone they could find, Greeks and Romans alike. Trajan, alarmed by this and other signs of trouble all over the empire, set out for Rome. He died on the way, at Selinus in Cilicia, on August 8, 117. His reign closes ominously. While he had been in the east, trouble had started in Africa, Egypt, Libya, Palestine, Sarmatia, Britain. He was deified, of course, and his triumph was celebrated after his death. Trajan's reign takes one more long step towards complete despotism, which we shall see when we consider the provinces. For Italy, Trajan did much. His new forum was the glory of Rome. There are columns and triumphal arches to commemorate his victories. He reclaimed the Campagna, built new harbors at Ostia, Centum Celle, and Ancona, built roads and aqueducts, and tried to arrest the decline of Italy in agriculture and manpower by extending the alimenta system of Nerva, forbidding emigration, encouraging settlements of the imperial lands, making senators invest in real estate in Italy, and so on. His provincial administration is a little less easy to surmise. In intention, it was excellent, but his long absence in the east led to difficulties. Numerous prosecutions for extortion show the extent of the evil and the emperor's efforts to stop it. This reign sees also a new phenomenon, the breakdown of local government on the financial side. Various municipalities have to receive curators, and the province of Bithynia and the free cities of Achaia had their financial administration taken over by imperial correctores. Pliny was sent to Bithynia, and his letters to Trajan and the replies are preserved. In the enormous mass of detail referred to the emperor we can see foreshadowed the complete centralization that was to come under Diocletian. Mention must also be made of the view that Trajan's wars were completely disastrous to the empire, overstraining its manpower and economic strength irrevocably. On this day in history, January 28, 814, the death of Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor, brings about the ascension of his son Louis the Pious as ruler of the Frankish Empire. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the life of Louis the Pious. Louis I, born 778, died 840, surnamed the Pious, Roman Emperor, third son of the Emperor Charlemagne and his wife Hildegard, was born at Chasseneuil in central France, and crowned King of the Aquitaine in 781. His tastes were ecclesiastical, rather than military. The government of his kingdom was mainly conducted by his counselors. In 794 or 795, he married Ermengarde, daughter of Ingram, Count of Haspin. After the deaths of his two elder brothers, Louis, at his father's command, crowned himself co-emperor at Aix-la-Chapelle on September 11, 813, and became sole ruler in the following January. He earned the surname of Pious by banishing his sisters and others of immoral life from court, by attempting to reform and purify monastic life, and by showing great liberality to the Church. In October 816, he was crowned emperor at Rheims by Pope Stephen IV, and at Aix in July 817 he arranged for a division of his empire among his sons. This was followed by a revolt of his nephew, Bernard, King of Italy. But the rising was easily suppressed, and Bernard was killed, although in 818 Louis pardoned the followers of Bernard and restored their estates. In 819 he married Judith, daughter of Welf I, Count of Bavaria, who in 823 bore him a son Charles, afterwards called the Bald. With the support of Judith's eldest stepson, Lothair, a district was carved out for Charles in 829. Discontent at this arrangement led to a rebellion in the following year, provoked by Judith's intrigues with her favorite, Bernard, Count of Barcelona. Lothair and his brother Pippin joined the rebels, and after Judith had been sent into a convent and Bernard had fled to Spain, an assembly was held at Compiègne, when Louis was practically deposed and Lothair became the real ruler of the empire. But at a second assembly held at Nimwegen in October 830, he was restored to power. Further trouble between Pippin and his father led to the nominal transfer of Aquitaine from Pippin to his brother Charles in 831. The emperor's plans for division of his dominions then led to a revolt of his three sons. Louis met them in 833 near Colmar, but owing possibly to influence of Pope Gregory IV, who took part in the negotiations, he found himself deserted by his supporters, and the treachery and falsehood which marked the proceedings gave to the place the name of Lügenfeld, or Field of Lies. Judith, charged with infidelity, was again banished. Louis was sent into a monastery at Saint Médard at Soissons, and the government of the empire was assumed by his sons. But when the younger Louis had failed to induce Lothair to treat the emperor in a more becoming fashion, he and Pippin took up arms on behalf of their father. The result was that in 834 Louis was restored to power at Saint Denis. Judith returned, and the kingdoms of Louis and Pippin were increased. The struggle with Lothar continued until the autumn, when he submitted to the emperor and was confined to Italy. An assembly at Diedenhofen declared the deposition of Louis to have been contrary to law, and a few days later he was publicly restored in the cathedral of Metz. In December 838 Pippin died, and the empire, except Bavaria, the kingdom of Louis, was now divided between Lothair, reconciled to his father, and Charles. The emperor was returning from suppressing a revolt on the part of his son Louis, when he died on June 20th, 840, on an island in the Rhine near Ingelheim. He was buried in the church of St. Arnulf at Metz. Louis, who was called Le Dauphin, counts as Louis I, King of France. On this day in history, January 29th, 904, Sergius III is elected pope after coming out of retirement to take over the papacy from the deposed anti-pope Christopher. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the life of Sergius III. Sergius III, elected pope by one of the factions in Rome in 898, simultaneously with Pope John IX, was expelled from the city by his adversaries. He reappeared in 904, seized the two claimants, Leo V and Christopher, who were disputing the succession of Benedict IV, and had them strangled. His adherents rallied around the Vesterius Theophylact, a powerful Roman functionary, and his wife, Theodora. Sergius is reputed to have been the lover of Theodora's daughter Marozia, by whom he is said to have had a son, who became pope as John XI. Sergius was very hostile to the memory of Pope Formosus, and refused to recognize any of the ordinances celebrated by him, thus causing grave disorders. He also affected to consider as antipopes not only John IX, but also his successors down to and including Christopher. He restored the Lateran Basilica, which had fallen down in 897. He died on April 14th, 911, and was succeeded by Anastasius III. On this day in history, January 30th, 1889, Archduke Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria, heir to the Austro-Hungarian crown, is found dead with his mistress, Baroness Marie Vetsera, in the Mayerling. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the life of Rudolf. Rudolf of Habsburg, born 1858, died 1889, Crown Prince of Austria, was born on August 21st, 1858, the only son of the Emperor Francis Joseph of Austria, and his wife Elizabeth. Great hopes centered on the boy, who possessed unusual talents. Although his father was chiefly intent on his military education, Rudolf's own chief interests were natural history and literature. The monumental description of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, Österreich-Ungarn in Wort und Bild, was truly his conception and, in part, his work. He also wrote some minor works of his own. He early developed an interest in modern literature and thought, became known as a free thinker, and even a revolutionary, and made no secret of his anti-clerical views. He thus drifted into increasing opposition to his father, which was accentuated by his notoriously easy morality. His marriage with Stephanie, daughter of the King of the Belgians, took place on May 10th, 1881, and was at first happy, although its only fruit, unfortunately for the Austrian succession, was one daughter, Elizabeth, afterwards Princess Windesgratz. Later he developed a deep passion for the young and beautiful Baroness Marie Vetsera, and on January 30th, 1889, the sudden and appalling news reached Vienna that the bodies of the two lovers had been found in Rudolf's hunting lodge of Mayerling, near Vienna. It was at once officially announced that the pair had committed suicide. All persons in any way connected with the story were sworn to secrecy, and the official dossier was excluded from the state archives. Numerous extraordinary rumors naturally arose, connecting the death with the Jesuits, the Hungarian nobles, or an injured husband. But it is generally accepted that the crown prince actually shot his lover and afterwards committed suicide in a fit of despair, partly due to his father's order to break off the liaison. On this day in history, January 31st, 1578, as part of the 80 Years' War and the Anglo-Spanish War, the Battle of Gembloux is a victory for Spanish forces led by Don John of Austria over a rebel army of Dutch, Flemish, English, Scottish, German, French, and Walloons. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the town of Gembloux. Gembloux, a town in the province of Namur, Belgium, 25 miles southeast of Brussels, on the main line to Namur. Population, estimated of 1930, was 5,198. Here, on January 31st, 1578, Don John of Austria defeated the army of the provinces under Antony de Gournay. In 1860, the State Institute of Agriculture was founded here. Gembloux is a busy railway center with engine works.